between Paul's command to be reverent in behavior and Peter's exhortation to have an imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit. You could describe these things in different ways. Modest, quiet and gentle spirit, harmonious, sympathetic, humble. This is not how our culture describes the working woman. And it's certainly not how we think of, how you're supposed to get ahead as a working person, period. And so what we want to do is we want to look at those qualities, and this is what we're really going to dive into very specifically the next 2 times that we meet. Look at these qualities, define them biblically from Scripture. What does it really mean? Because we also have a lot of misconceptions. Well, does being a quiet and gentle spirit mean that I can never speak and I just have to sit there and never talk? I don't think that's really what Scripture's communicating, and we'll see that as we study out the Word. Does being, harmonious mean that I can never disagree with anyone, ever? No. Again, Scripture calls us to be people of truthfulness and speak the truth in love, and to speak the truth. So we will look at those qualities more specifically and study them out, and then also try to make those applications. Okay, so this is what Scripture means by what it says, then how do I apply it to a work environment? And then as I was studying it out, I also found it very interesting as I dove into these passages and looked at the greater context surrounding them. Both Paul and Peter, very close to where they address wives, address the issue of slaves and their masters. And since we're looking at women as, in the context of employment, it was important to look at those passages and see, okay, what are the parallels here? What are the application points that we can make? Titus 2, 9 through 10 tells us, urge bondslaves to be subject to their own masters in everything, to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, but showing all good faith, so that they will adorn the gospel of God in every respect. We're not to dishonor the word. We want to adorn the gospel. Similarly, 1 Peter 2, 18 through 20 states, servants, be submissive to your master with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if for the sake of conscience towards God a person bears up under sorrow when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there when you sin and are harshly treated? You endure it with patience? But when you do right and suffer for it, you patiently endure. This finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you. So actually, Pastor Steve had a resource that he had studied out on the issue of slavery in the New Testament that was really helpful to me as I studied this. Jen actually had mentioned it to me, and then I was like, yeah, that would be great, send it over. I thought it was going to be like a 15-page paper from a seminary class. It was like 50 pages long or something. But it was very, very helpful, because we have a tendency to read these passages in our mind and insert employer, because that's kind of the closest thing of our current context. Our employment today is nothing like the Roman slavery that these folks were under, that Paul is writing to. It's also, Roman slavery was also nothing like slavery in America in the 1800s, or early 1900s, or, any of our context. It's kind of, and I think it's some hermeneutics class, somebody made this point one time, but we have this tendency to, and this is just an example. We have this tendency, like we read about Job, or we read about Jonah and the fish, and we picture Monstro, the whale in Pinocchio, swallowing Pinocchio, because that's the only image that's in our head. Well, okay, that's Disney movie, and it's nothing like probably what Jonah experienced in the belly of a whale. In a similar kind of way, we can very easily take what we know from our U.S. history class in high school or college or wherever about what slavery was like in America and apply that to these passages. And while that's probably better than just inserting employer and thinking about what our relationship with our boss is like, it's still not actually accurate to what Roman slavery was like. So there's more detail here, and I probably, for the sake of time, don't have time to do it a lot of justice. But suffice it to say that Roman slavery was very different than American slavery in that it was not really ethnically based. It wasn't based on any sort of racial or ethnic sort of conflict or superiority philosophy. And it started primarily because the Roman Empire was so intent on conquering all these other areas that most of the freedmen were conscripted into the army. And so then there was like this lack of anybody to do sort of the manual labor that needed to be done for life. I mean, they didn't have all the modern conveniences that we have, so all of those just normal functions of life were very difficult, and they needed people to do them. And so they started to, the buying and selling of slaves started to become a bigger and bigger issue to do that as work. And people would sell themselves into slavery sometimes. You could actually get into and out of slavery in some cases a little bit more easily. It was more possible to work yourself out of slavery in that culture. And then ironically enough, oftentimes people would work themselves out of slavery and then become slave owners themselves. That was not completely unheard of, because it was sort of like the sign that you had arrived. And then once they sort of saw an economic benefit from slavery, the very thing that sort of started them in this path in terms of their conquering, it also then fed that, because as they needed more and more slaves then. Their appetite for slavery sort of became greater, and that also became a reason to continue to conquer all these other nations, because then they had a greater pool of people to pull in to be slaves and to serve them. The other, I think, super important point is slaves literally had no rights in this culture. They could be treated however they wanted to treat them. And sometimes they would hire other slaves to beat their slaves because they didn't want to be, troubled to have to deal with that themselves. But people were beaten to the point of death. They were forced into prostitution. I mean, there was all sorts of brutalities that occurred. And so when Paul says, or when Peter says, to be submissive to your master no matter how unreasonable they are. We're not talking about somebody who, expects you to stay until 6 o'clock instead of leaving at 5. Like, we're talking about somebody who could literally take your life. And that doesn't mean that those passages don't apply to us today, but when we understand that, even just a little bit, it dramatically changes our perspective on what it means for us to submit to an unreasonable master, because what we're being faced with is generally, and I'm not trying to make light of, I recognize that there are very difficult situations in people's workplaces at times, and we can, today we can, even with the protections we have in place, we can have, very cruel bosses. But it does put it in a unique and new perspective, I think, for us. And so that will greatly impact our application of those truths and how we think about how we want to respond to our boss and what it means for us to be able to adorn the gospel in that way. So moving from the sort of quick biblical overview, I want to go into the historical context. And it's in some ways it's a little bit of an abrupt transition, because really when we're looking at the biblical overview, we're understanding that's really what we fundamentally want to get to the point where that's what guides how we decide how we're going to be in the workplace. The reality is that our culture shapes that a lot more than sometimes our biblical understanding shapes how we respond to and think about work.